The transformation of a collection of fractured German states into the most powerful empire in Europe represents one of the most dramatic political achievements of the 19th century. And nowhere is this transformation more clearly documented than in the methodical, disciplined march toward unity that characterized Prussian policy throughout the decades leading to 1871. The German Empire emerged not through revolution or sudden inspiration, but through the calculated application of blood and iron, through victories won on battlefields from Königgrätz to Sedan, through the patient construction of alliances and the ruthless elimination of obstacles to German greatness. The winter of 1870 brought bitter cold to the battlefields of France, where Prussian forces had systematically dismantled the military power of Napoleon III's Second Empire. The siege of Paris dragged on through months of starvation and desperation, while in the provisional capital of Versailles, Prussian officers planned not merely the conclusion of a war, but the birth of a nation. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor whose diplomatic genius had orchestrated this moment, understood that military victory alone would not suffice to create lasting unity among the German peoples. The proclamation of empire required theater, symbolism, and the careful orchestration of legitimacy that would bind together Bavarians and Saxons, Württembergers and Prussians under a single crown. The Palace of Versailles, symbol of French royal power and European grandeur, provided the perfect stage for this dramatic transformation. On January 18, 1871, as French artillery shells fell silent around the besieged capital, the Hall of Mirrors witnessed a ceremony that would reshape the balance of power across Europe. King Wilhelm I of Prussia, reluctant and somewhat bewildered by the magnitude of the moment, stood before an assembly of German princes, generals, and dignitaries who had gathered to proclaim him Kaiser of the newly unified German Reich. The irony was deliberate and devastating. In the very palace where Louis XIV had once proclaimed the supremacy of French civilization, German boots now echoed through marble corridors as a new empire announced its arrival on the world stage. Bismarck's diplomatic masterpiece had required years of careful preparation and the precise application of military force at crucial moments. The three wars of German unification against Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France in 1870–71 had demonstrated Prussian military superiority while providing the external threats necessary to bind German states together in common cause. The Zollverein, the customs union that had gradually integrated German economies since the 1830s, provided the economic foundation for political unity, while the German Confederation's obvious inadequacies in the face of modern challenges had discredited the old order of loose association and Austrian dominance. The proclamation ceremony itself reflected the careful balance of forces that would characterize the new empire. Wilhelm I, crowned Kaiser at age 73, embodied the traditional legitimacy of Prussian monarchy while accepting the expanded responsibilities of German leadership. His son, Crown Prince Friedrich, represented liberal hopes for constitutional government and closer ties with Western European democratic traditions. Bismarck, positioned strategically near the throne in his white uniform of a Prussian general, symbolized the pragmatic application of power that had made unification possible. The assembled princes of Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, and Baden represented the federal structure that would preserve local traditions while subordinating regional interests to imperial authority. The military officers who filled the Hall of Mirrors represented more than ceremonial presence. They embodied the Prussian military system that would serve as the backbone of German power. The general staff, perfected through decades of careful study and systematic preparation, had demonstrated its superiority over French military organization through rapid mobilization, superior logistics, and the innovative use of railway networks for strategic deployment. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, architect of victories that had made empire possible, stood among the witnesses as living proof that German military science had surpassed all European rivals. The transformation from German Confederation to German Empire required more than ceremonial proclamation. It demanded the construction of new institutions capable of governing a territory stretching from the Rhine to the Russian border, from the North Sea to the Austrian frontier. The imperial constitution, carefully crafted to balance Prussian dominance with federal representation, created a complex system of government that preserved the appearance of democratic participation while ensuring that real power remained concentrated in Prussian hands. The Bundesrat, representing the German states, provided a forum for regional interests while the Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, offered the illusion of popular government within carefully defined limits. The economic foundations of the new empire rested on the rapid industrialization that had transformed German society throughout the 19th century. The coal fields of the Ruhr Valley, the iron deposits of Silesia, and the growing network of railways that connected raw materials with manufacturing centers had created the material basis for German power. The Krupp works at Essen, already famous throughout Europe for the quality of their steel and artillery, symbolized the marriage of industrial capacity with military necessity that would characterize imperial development. The precision and efficiency that had made German manufactured goods competitive in world markets now served the larger purpose of national greatness. The population that found itself suddenly united under the German crown represented a remarkable diversity of regional traditions, religious affiliations, and economic interests. Prussia's Protestant efficiency dominated the northern regions, while Catholic Bavaria maintained its distinct cultural identity and political autonomy. The Rhineland's commercial sophistication contrasted with the agricultural traditions of East Prussia, while the industrial workers of Saxony developed political consciousness that would challenge traditional authority. The empire's success would depend on its ability to channel these diverse energies toward common purposes, while preventing regional differences from undermining central authority. The international implications of German unification immediately altered the European balance of power that had prevailed since the Congress of Vienna. France, humiliated by military defeat and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, emerged from the war determined to reverse the verdict of 1871 and restore its position as Europe's dominant continental power. Britain watched the rise of German industrial capacity with growing concern for its own commercial supremacy, while Russia calculated the implications of having a powerful and efficiently organized neighbor along its western frontier. Austria-Hungary, excluded from German affairs by its defeat in 1866, faced the challenge of maintaining imperial cohesion while accommodating the reality of Prussian hegemony in Central Europe. The new empire's capital, Berlin, experienced rapid transformation as it adapted to its expanded role as the center of German political and cultural life. The city's population, swelled by officials, officers, and entrepreneurs drawn by imperial opportunities, grew from approximately 800,000 in 1871 to over 2 million by the century's end. New government buildings, military installations, and cultural institutions reflected the empire's ambitions, while the expansion of railway connections made Berlin the hub of German transportation and communication networks. The Unter den Linden, the Brandenburg Gate, and the emerging government quarter became symbols of imperial power that proclaimed German achievement to the world. The cultural implications of unification extended far beyond political and economic changes. The German language, standardized and promoted through universal education, became the medium for expressing a shared national identity that transcended regional boundaries. German universities, already renowned throughout Europe for their scholarship and scientific research, assumed new importance as training grounds for the civil servants, military officers, and technical specialists required by modern imperial administration. The music of Wagner, celebrating Germanic mythology and heroic ideals, provided artistic expression for the empire's self-image, while German philosophy and literature explored the implications of national unity and cultural achievement. The military system that had made unification possible underwent systematic expansion and refinement to meet the requirements of defending the new empire. Universal conscription, borrowed from Prussian tradition and extended throughout German territories, created a citizen army that combined military training with patriotic education. The General Staff, now responsible for defending extended frontiers against potentially hostile neighbors, developed increasingly sophisticated plans for rapid mobilization and coordinated operations across multiple theaters of war. The fortification of the Rhine, the development of naval capacity, and the modernization of artillery and small arms reflected the empire's determination to maintain military superiority against all potential combinations of enemies. The economic policies adopted by the new government reflected Bismarck's understanding that industrial development and commercial expansion were essential components of national power. The establishment of a unified currency, legal system, and commercial code eliminated barriers to internal trade, while the construction of strategic railways and telegraph lines improved communication and transportation throughout imperial territories. Protective tariffs sheltered German industry from foreign competition, while government investment in education, and infrastructure created conditions favorable to continued economic growth. The symbiotic relationship between state policy and private enterprise that characterized German development distinguished imperial economic strategy from the more laissez-faire approaches adopted by Britain and France. The religious settlement that accompanied political unification required careful navigation of tensions between Protestant Prussia and Catholic regions of the South and West. The Kulturkampf, Bismarck's conflict with the Catholic Church over state authority in education and civil administration, reflected deeper questions about the relationship between religious loyalty and national identity. While this struggle would eventually be resolved through compromise and accommodation, it demonstrated the challenges involved in creating unified institutions capable of governing populations with diverse religious and cultural traditions. The legislative achievements of the early imperial period established legal frameworks that would govern German society for decades to come. The civil code, commercial code, and criminal code created uniform legal standards throughout the empire while preserving certain regional variations in family law and local administration. The establishment of imperial courts and standardized legal procedures enhanced the efficiency of justice while reinforcing central authority over local judicial traditions. These institutional innovations reflected the systematic approach to governance that characterized German administrative practice and distinguished imperial management from the often improvised arrangements of earlier periods. As the decade of the 1870s progressed, the German Empire established itself as a major factor in European politics and international affairs. Bismarck's diplomatic system, based on alliances with Austria-Hungary and Russia combined with careful isolation of France, provided security for German development while maintaining European peace. The Congress of Berlin in 1878, where Bismarck served as honest broker in resolving Eastern European tensions, demonstrated German diplomatic influence while avoiding the entangling commitments that might compromise imperial interests. This period of consolidation allowed internal development to proceed without external interference while establishing Germany's reputation as a responsible and conservative force in international relations. The social transformations accompanying rapid industrialization created new challenges for imperial governance. The growth of urban populations, the emergence of industrial working classes, and the development of socialist political organizations represented forces that traditional aristocratic and bureaucratic institutions were not equipped to handle. The Social Democratic Party, founded in 1875, provided political expression for working-class grievances while advocating systematic changes in German society and government. The anti-socialist laws, enacted in 1878, reflected official concern about the revolutionary potential of organized labor while demonstrating the empire's determination to maintain existing social and political arrangements through legislative action. The educational system that developed during the early imperial period reflected both the empire's commitment to technical and scientific advancement and its concern for maintaining political loyalty and social stability. German universities, technical institutes, and secondary schools established international reputations for excellence while producing the educated personnel required by modern industrial society. The emphasis on classical learning, scientific research, and technical training created an educated population capable of supporting continued economic and military development, while universal elementary education ensured basic literacy and numerical skills throughout the population. By 1880, the German Empire had successfully completed its initial phase of consolidation and established itself as the dominant power in continental Europe. The institutions created during the first decade of unity, constitutional government, universal conscription, unified legal and economic systems, and diplomatic arrangements that preserved European peace, provided the framework for the remarkable development that would characterize the following decades. The empire that emerged from this period of formation possessed the population, resources, institutions, and international position necessary to challenge British industrial supremacy and assert German claims to world power status. The legacy of this founding decade would influence German development throughout the imperial period and beyond. The balance between federal structure and central authority, the relationship between military and civilian institutions, and the tension between democratic forms and authoritarian reality established patterns that would persist until the empire's collapse in 1918. Most significantly, the successful use of military force to achieve political objectives and the celebration of disciplined efficiency as a national virtue created expectations and attitudes that would shape German responses to future challenges and opportunities.
2. Золотий век індустр. 1871, 1888, 25,000 символів.
The rhythmic hammering of steel upon steel echoed across the industrial landscape of the Ruhr Valley as the German Empire entered its golden age of manufacturing and technological achievement. The decade following unification witnessed a transformation so profound and systematic that it would establish Germany as the workshop of continental Europe, challenging British industrial supremacy through the methodical application of scientific knowledge, organizational efficiency, and disciplined labor. This was not merely economic growth, but the conscious construction of industrial power designed to serve imperial ambitions and demonstrate German superiority in the arts of modern civilization. The coal mines of the Ruhr Basin stretched like black scars across the landscape, their pit heads and slag heaps marking the underground chambers where German miners extracted the fuel that powered imperial industry. The region between Dortmund and Duisburg became a vast industrial complex where coal, iron ore, and human labor combined to produce the steel that armed German regiments and built German railways. The Krupp works at Essen, expanding continuously throughout the 1870s and 1880s, employed over 20,000 workers by 1887 and produced not merely weapons for the German military, but locomotives, machinery, and steel products that carried German engineering reputation to markets throughout the world. Alfred Krupp, the Cannon King, whose family name had become synonymous with German industrial might, embodied the marriage of technical innovation with patriotic service that characterized imperial manufacturing. His factories, organized with military precision and scientific efficiency, demonstrated how modern industrial methods could be applied to serve national purposes. The workers' housing, company schools, and social welfare programs that surrounded the Krupp plants reflected paternalistic approaches to labor management that combined genuine concern for employee welfare with systematic control over workforce behavior and political attitudes. The railway network that spread across German territory during these decades represented more than transportation infrastructure. It constituted the nervous system of imperial power, connecting raw materials with manufacturing centers, finished products with markets, and military units with strategic positions along the empire's expanding frontiers. The standardization of track gauge, the coordination of schedules, and the integration of telegraph communication with train operations demonstrated the systematic approach to organization that distinguished German engineering from the often haphazard development patterns of other nations. The precision machinery produced in German workshops achieved international recognition for reliability and technical sophistication that surpassed even British manufacturing standards. The optical instruments manufactured by Zeiss in Jena, the electrical equipment produced by Siemens in Berlin, and the chemical products developed by BASF in Ludwigshafen established German brands as symbols of quality and innovation throughout global markets. These achievements reflected not accidental discoveries or individual genius, but the systematic application of scientific research to practical problems through institutions that consciously cultivated technical knowledge for commercial and military purposes. German universities during this period achieved preeminence in scientific research and technical education that attracted students from throughout the world. The University of Berlin, with its constellation of distinguished professors and well-equipped laboratories, became a model for modern higher education that combined theoretical investigation with practical application. The technical institutes established in major industrial centers provided specialized training for engineers, chemists, and managers who would staff the expanding manufacturing sector while maintaining connections between academic research and industrial development. The chemical industry that emerged in German manufacturing centers revolutionized both industrial processes and everyday life through systematic research into synthetic materials and manufacturing techniques. The development of coal tar dyes eliminated dependence on natural colorants while creating export products that dominated world markets through superior quality and competitive pricing. The production of synthetic fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemicals demonstrated how scientific knowledge could be transformed into commercial advantage while serving strategic purposes by reducing dependence on imported materials. The steel industry that developed around Essen, Dortmund, and other Ruhr Valley centers achieved production levels that challenged British supremacy in this crucial sector. The introduction of the Bessemer process, refined through German engineering innovations, enabled mass production of high-quality steel at costs that made German products competitive in international markets. The vertical integration of mining, smelting, and manufacturing operations within single corporate entities created efficiencies that reduced costs while ensuring quality control throughout the production process. The banking system that evolved to finance this industrial expansion demonstrated sophisticated understanding of capital mobilization and investment coordination. The great German banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and Commerzbank, established close relationships with manufacturing enterprises that enabled long-term planning and systematic development of industrial capacity. This bank-industry nexus distinguished German financial practice from British and French models by emphasizing sustained investment in productive capacity rather than short-term speculation in financial instruments. The working class that emerged from this industrial transformation represented a new social force in German society, concentrated in manufacturing centers and organized through trade unions and political parties that challenged traditional authority structures. The living conditions in industrial cities, while harsh by modern standards, generally provided better material circumstances than rural poverty had offered, while factory discipline and urban life created new forms of social consciousness and political awareness. The gradual development of worker housing, education, and social insurance reflected both paternalistic control and genuine recognition that industrial society required more sophisticated approaches to social management. The cultural flowering that accompanied industrial development demonstrated how material prosperity could support artistic and intellectual achievement. German music, dominated by the towering figures of Wagner and Brahms, achieved international recognition while expressing distinctively German themes and sensibilities. The construction of opera houses, concert halls, and theaters in major cities provided venues for cultural expression, while the expansion of publishing, journalism, and popular literature created new forms of communication and entertainment for educated urban populations. The scientific achievements of this period established German leadership in fields ranging from physics and chemistry to medicine and biology. The work of scientists like Helmholtz, Kirchhoff, and Bunsen advanced fundamental understanding while creating practical applications that enhanced German industrial and military capabilities. German medical schools attracted students from throughout the world, while German pharmaceutical companies developed products that alleviated suffering while generating profits that supported continued research and development. The military applications of industrial advancement ensured that technological progress served strategic purposes while demonstrating German superiority in the practical arts of warfare. The Krupp artillery pieces that armed German fortresses and field armies represented the most advanced military technology available, while innovations in small arms, explosives, and military engineering maintained German military superiority over potential enemies. The integration of industrial capacity with military planning created systematic approaches to defense production that would prove crucial during future conflicts. The transportation revolution that accompanied railway expansion included the development of improved road networks, canal systems, and harbor facilities that enhanced German commercial capabilities while serving strategic military purposes. The construction of the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal, connecting the North and Baltic Seas, demonstrated the empire's commitment to infrastructure projects that served both commercial and naval interests. The systematic improvement of river navigation and harbor facilities reflected understanding that modern industrial society required comprehensive transportation networks capable of moving both raw materials and finished products efficiently. The agricultural improvements that occurred alongside industrial development ensured adequate food production for growing urban populations, while maintaining the rural social structures that supported traditional authority. The application of scientific methods to farming, including improved fertilizers, better seed varieties, and more efficient cultivation techniques, increased productivity, while the construction of rural railways connected agricultural regions with urban markets. The preservation of large estates in East Prussia and other regions maintained aristocratic influence, while demonstrating that traditional social arrangements could adapt to modern economic conditions. The educational systems that developed during this period created the skilled workforce required by advanced industrial society while maintaining social discipline and political loyalty. The expansion of technical education, the improvement of elementary schools, and the development of commercial training programs produced literate, numerate workers capable of operating complex machinery and following detailed instructions. The emphasis on discipline, punctuality, and respect for authority in educational settings prepared students for industrial employment while reinforcing social values that supported existing political arrangements. The urban planning and architectural achievements of the period reflected both the practical requirements of industrial society and the empire's cultural ambitions. The reconstruction of Berlin, the expansion of Hamburg and Bremen, and the development of new industrial cities demonstrated systematic approaches to urban development that balanced commercial efficiency with social order. The construction of impressive public buildings, parks, and cultural institutions proclaimed German achievement while providing amenities that enhanced urban life for all social classes. The International Exhibition and World's Fair participation during this period showcased German industrial achievements while competing for recognition and markets against British, French, and American manufacturers. German displays at the Vienna World Exhibition of 1873, the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876, and subsequent international events demonstrated technical superiority and design excellence that enhanced German commercial reputation while serving broader purposes of national prestige and diplomatic influence. The development of German engineering firms and construction companies enabled the export of technical expertise and industrial equipment to markets throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America. German engineers built railways in the Ottoman Empire, established factories in Russia, and provided technical services throughout the world while German manufacturers supplied machinery, tools, and finished products to customers who valued German quality and reliability. These commercial relationships created political influence while demonstrating German capabilities in practical and systematic ways. The social welfare innovations developed during this period, including workers' compensation, health insurance, and old age pensions, represented pioneering efforts to address the social problems created by industrial development while maintaining political stability and workforce loyalty. These programs, while limited in scope and conservative in purpose, demonstrated German leadership in social policy while creating precedents that would influence development throughout the industrialized world. The corporate organizational structures that emerged during this period of expansion created new forms of business management that maximized efficiency while coordinating complex operations across multiple locations and product lines. The development of professional management, systematic accounting procedures, and scientific approaches to production planning distinguished German business practice from the often informal arrangements that characterized earlier commercial operations. These organizational innovations contributed to German competitive advantages while creating models that would be adopted throughout the industrialized world. The intellectual and cultural institutions that flourished during the golden age of German industry created environments where scientific research, artistic expression, and technological innovation could flourish under conditions of political stability and material prosperity. The Max Planck Institutes, the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, and other research organizations established German leadership in scientific investigation while universities, museums, and libraries preserved cultural heritage while promoting continued learning and intellectual development. By 1888, the German Empire had achieved industrial leadership in Europe while establishing itself as a major force in world markets. The coal mines, steel mills, chemical plants, and machinery workshops that dotted the German landscape produced more than economic wealth. They generated the material foundation for world power while demonstrating the superiority of German methods in organization, education, and systematic development. The empire that emerged from this golden age of industrial development possessed the technological capabilities, organizational expertise, and material resources necessary to challenge established powers while pursuing expanded influence in world affairs.
3. Кайзер Вільгельм II, з 1888, 25.00 символів.
The death of Kaiser Friedrich III after only 99 days on the throne brought to power a young man whose restless energy and imperial ambitions would fundamentally alter the character of German policy and set the empire on a collision course with the established powers of Europe. Wilhelm II, 29 years old at his accession in 1888, embodied both the promise and the peril of a new generation that had known only German unity and industrial prosperity, yet chafed against the cautious diplomacy and conservative policies that had secured these achievements. His reign would witness the transformation of Germany from a satisfied continental power into a restless challenger of the global order, pursuing a place in the sun that would ultimately lead to catastrophic war. The new Kaiser's personality combined intellectual brilliance with emotional instability, strategic vision with tactical impulsiveness, and genuine patriotic devotion with dangerous megalomania. His withered left arm, the result of a difficult birth, had been carefully concealed throughout his youth, but left psychological scars that manifested in aggressive behavior and compensatory displays of military prowess. The rigorous military education that had shaped his worldview emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and the supreme importance of strength in international relations, while his extensive travels and cosmopolitan contacts had given him a sophisticated understanding of world affairs that his advisors often underestimated. The young Kaiser's relationship with Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who had created the German Empire and guided its early development, represented a generational conflict that would reshape imperial policy. Bismarck, now 73 and increasingly rigid in his methods, found himself dealing with a sovereign who questioned established policies and demanded greater personal involvement in governmental decisions. The tensions that developed between the aging statesman and the impetuous young ruler reflected deeper questions about the direction of German development and the empire's role in world affairs. The dismissal of Bismarck in March 1890 marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in German history, characterized by more aggressive foreign policy and less systematic domestic governance. The Kaiser's famous comment that "the course remains the same" proved tragically inaccurate as German policy underwent fundamental changes that abandoned the careful balance and conservative restraint that had characterized the Bismarckian system. The new leadership, lacking the Iron Chancellor's diplomatic genius and international reputation, pursued policies that reflected imperial ambitions rather than strategic calculation. The naval program that became the centerpiece of Wilhelm II's imperial strategy represented a fundamental departure from traditional German priorities and a direct challenge to British naval supremacy. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, appointed Secretary of State for the Navy in 1897, developed a comprehensive plan for fleet construction that aimed to create a German navy powerful enough to challenge British control of European waters. The Navy laws of 1898 and 1900 committed Germany to systematic naval expansion that would transform the empire from a continental power into a global force capable of projecting military strength across the world's oceans. The construction of the High Seas Fleet required enormous investments in shipbuilding facilities, naval bases, and technical expertise that strained imperial finances while creating new forms of international tension. The naval yards at Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, and other Baltic and North seaports expanded dramatically as German shipbuilders mastered the complex technologies required for modern warship construction. The battleships, cruisers, and submarines that emerged from these facilities represented the most advanced naval technology available, while their growing numbers proclaimed German determination to challenge established maritime powers. The Kaiser's personal fascination with naval affairs reflected broader changes in German strategic thinking that emphasized sea power as essential for world power status. His regular attendance at naval reviews, his detailed involvement in ship design, and his cultivation of naval officers demonstrated the importance he attached to fleet development while providing powerful symbolic support for expensive naval programs. The annual Kiel Week celebrations, combining naval displays with international social events, showcased German maritime ambitions while creating forums for diplomatic interaction with representatives of other naval powers. The colonial policy pursued during Wilhelm II's reign represented another departure from Bismarckian restraint and reflected the empire's growing confidence in its ability to compete with established imperial powers. The acquisition of territories in Africa, the Pacific, and China demonstrated German determination to secure overseas markets, raw materials, and strategic positions that would support continued economic growth and political influence. These colonial ventures, while often unprofitable and strategically questionable, served symbolic purposes by proclaiming German equality with Britain, France, and other imperial powers. The German East Africa colony, extending from the coast of present-day Tanzania into the interior highlands, became a showcase for German administrative efficiency and economic development. The construction of railways, the establishment of plantations, and the development of port facilities demonstrated German capabilities in colonial management while providing markets for German-manufactured goods and sources of tropical products. The systematic approach to colonial development, emphasizing scientific agriculture, modern transportation, and efficient administration, distinguished German methods from the often haphazard approaches of other colonial powers. The involvement in Chinese affairs during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 provided opportunities for German military and naval forces to demonstrate their capabilities on a global stage while securing strategic positions in East Asia. The Kaiser's inflammatory speech urging German troops to behave like Huns and show no mercy reflected the aggressive rhetoric that increasingly characterized imperial policy. The establishment of the Kyotsku Concession, with its modern port facilities and naval base at Tsingtao, created a German foothold in the Far East that served both commercial and strategic purposes. The domestic policies implemented during Wilhelm II's reign reflected the complex challenges of governing an industrial society experiencing rapid social and economic change. The growth of social democratic political organization, the expansion of trade union membership, and the development of working-class consciousness created new forms of political opposition that traditional conservative methods could not adequately address. The alternation between repressive measures and social welfare reforms demonstrated the government's uncertainty about how to manage these new social forces while maintaining existing political arrangements. The cultural and intellectual developments that occurred during this period reflected both the confidence and the anxieties of a society experiencing unprecedented prosperity and international influence. The architectural projects undertaken in Berlin and other major cities proclaimed German achievement while providing practical facilities for expanded governmental and commercial activities. The construction of the Reichstag building, completed in 1894, created an impressive setting for parliamentary proceedings, while its innovative steel and glass dome symbolized the marriage of traditional authority with modern technology. The educational expansion that characterized this period produced the skilled personnel required by an increasingly complex industrial and administrative system, while maintaining emphasis on discipline, patriotism, and respect for authority. The growth of technical institutes, commercial schools, and professional training programs reflected recognition that modern society required more sophisticated forms of education, while the continued emphasis on classical learning and military training preserved traditional cultural values and social hierarchies. The military developments during Wilhelm II's reign maintained German superiority in land warfare, while adapting to technological innovations that transformed the nature of modern combat. The expansion of the officer corps, the improvement of training programs, and the modernization of equipment ensured that German armies remained the most effective military force in Europe. The development of new artillery, the improvement of fortifications, and the systematic planning for future conflicts demonstrated continued commitment to military excellence while reflecting growing awareness that future wars would require unprecedented mobilization of national resources. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during this period reflected the Kaiser's personal involvement in foreign affairs and his determination to assert German influence in international relations. His correspondence with Tsar Nicholas II, his meetings with British royalty, and his interventions in various international crises demonstrated both his sophisticated understanding of European politics and his tendency toward impulsive actions that complicated German diplomatic positions. The system of personal diplomacy that he favored often conflicted with professional diplomatic advice and created confusion about German intentions among other powers. The Morocco crisis of 1905 to 1906 demonstrated both German diplomatic capabilities and the limitations of aggressive tactics in dealing with established imperial powers. The Kaiser's dramatic landing at Tangier and his public support for Moroccan independence challenged French expansion in North Africa, while testing the solidarity of the Anglo-French Entente. The Algeciras Conference that resolved this crisis revealed the extent to which Germany had become diplomatically isolated, while demonstrating that confrontational tactics could not achieve German objectives against united opposition. The economic policies pursued during this period reflected efforts to maintain German competitive advantages, while addressing the social tensions created by rapid industrial development. The expansion of social insurance programs, the regulation of working conditions, and the development of labor relations procedures represented pioneering efforts to manage industrial society while preserving political stability. These innovations influenced social policy development throughout the industrialized world while demonstrating German leadership in addressing the challenges of modern industrial society. The technological achievements of this period maintained German leadership in crucial industrial sectors while creating new forms of economic and military capability. The development of the internal combustion engine, advances in electrical technology, and innovations in chemical production enhanced German competitive advantages while providing the technical foundations for future military and economic development. The systematic approach to research and development, emphasizing cooperation between universities, government institutions, and private industry, created organizational models that maximized innovative capacity while serving national strategic purposes. The press and propaganda developments during Wilhelm II's reign reflected both the democratization of German society and the government's efforts to influence public opinion in support of imperial policies. The expansion of newspaper circulation, the development of mass-market periodicals, and the improvement of communication technologies created new forms of political participation while providing opportunities for governmental influence over public attitudes. The Kaiser's own relationship with journalists and his frequent public statements demonstrated understanding of modern publicity methods while revealing the challenges of managing public communication in democratic societies. The international exhibitions and cultural exchanges that occurred during this period showcased German achievements while competing for recognition and influence against other major powers. German participation in world's fairs, international conferences, and cultural events demonstrated the empire's confidence in its capabilities while creating opportunities for diplomatic and commercial interaction. The systematic promotion of German language, literature, and scientific achievement reflected broader efforts to establish cultural influence that would support political and economic objectives. The religious and social policies of this period addressed the complex challenges of governing a society that included significant Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish populations with varying degrees of political loyalty and cultural integration. The resolution of the Kulturkampf through compromise and accommodation demonstrated the government's recognition that religious persecution was counterproductive, while efforts to integrate Jewish citizens into German society reflected both genuine commitment to equality and tactical recognition of Jewish contributions to German economic and intellectual development. The fiscal and monetary policies implemented during Wilhelm II's reign reflected the enormous costs associated with naval construction, colonial administration, and expanded military establishments. The development of new taxation systems, the expansion of government borrowing, and the management of currency and credit demonstrated sophisticated understanding of modern public finance, while revealing the financial strains created by ambitious imperial policies. The growing burden of military expenditures created political tensions that would ultimately contribute to the empire's downfall. The labor relations and social welfare developments during this period represented efforts to maintain social stability while accommodating the legitimate demands of industrial workers for improved conditions and political representation. The expansion of accident insurance, health coverage, and old age pensions created comprehensive social security systems that reduced worker grievances while maintaining employer authority and governmental control. These innovations influenced social policy development throughout the industrialized world while demonstrating that conservative governments could adapt to changing social conditions. By 1914, the German Empire under Wilhelm II had achieved unprecedented prosperity and international influence, while simultaneously creating the conditions that would lead to catastrophic war. The naval program had challenged British supremacy without achieving German security. Colonial expansion had created international tensions without providing significant economic benefits, and aggressive diplomacy had isolated Germany from potential allies while encouraging the formation of hostile coalitions. The empire that had emerged from this quarter-century of rapid change possessed enormous material capabilities and cultural achievements, but had sacrificed the strategic wisdom and diplomatic flexibility that had secured German development during the Bismarckian era.
4. Шлях до війни. 1890 і 1914. 25.000 символів.
The measured cadence of diplomatic correspondence masked the gathering storm that would engulf Europe in the greatest catastrophe in human history. Each carefully worded telegram, each precisely choreographed state visit, each methodically negotiated alliance brought the German Empire closer to the precipice that would destroy not only the Hohenzollern dynasty but the entire world order that had emerged from the Congress of Vienna. The quarter-century between Bismarck's dismissal and the assassination at Sarajevo witnessed the systematic dismantling of European stability through a series of diplomatic miscalculations, strategic misjudgments, and fateful decisions that transformed minor regional disputes into the triggers for global warfare. The alliance system that emerged after 1890 represented a fundamental departure from Bismarckian diplomatic wisdom, replacing flexible arrangements that preserved German options with rigid commitments that limited imperial freedom of action while encouraging dangerous confrontations with other major powers. The dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, renewed and strengthened throughout this period, bound Germany to support Habsburg interests in the volatile Balkans, regardless of the broader implications for European peace. This commitment, while reflecting legitimate concerns about Russian expansion and pan-Slavic nationalism, increasingly drew Germany into conflicts that had little direct bearing on German national interests but enormous potential for escalation into general war. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 represented the nightmare scenario that Bismarck's diplomacy had sought to prevent. The emergence of a two-front threat that would require Germany to fight simultaneous wars against enemies positioned on both eastern and western frontiers. The military implications of this strategic encirclement dominated German planning throughout the following decades and contributed to the development of increasingly aggressive strategies designed to achieve rapid victory before enemy coalitions could fully mobilize their combined resources. The Schlieffen Plan, conceived as a solution to the two-front problem, would ultimately guarantee that any European conflict involving Germany would become a general war. The naval rivalry with Britain that intensified throughout this period transformed a traditional friendship into mutual suspicion and ultimately implacable hostility. The German decision to challenge British naval supremacy through systematic fleet construction created security dilemmas that no amount of diplomatic reassurance could resolve. British observers, accustomed to unchallenged control of European waters, interpreted German naval expansion as a direct threat to the island kingdom's survival, while German leaders viewed British resistance to legitimate German maritime aspirations as evidence of perfidious attempts to maintain artificial supremacy through intimidation and diplomatic manipulation. The Morocco crises of 1905 and 1911 demonstrated the dangerous dynamics that had emerged from these alliance commitments and strategic rivalries. In both instances, German attempts to assert legitimate interests in North African affairs became tests of alliance solidarity that strengthened hostile coalitions while revealing the extent of German diplomatic isolation. The Kaiser's theatrical intervention at Tangier in 1905, intended to demonstrate German power and disrupt the Anglo-French Entente, instead provided Britain and France with opportunities to coordinate their responses while demonstrating to other powers the aggressive character of German diplomacy. The Algeciras Conference of 1906, convened to resolve the First Morocco Crisis, revealed the systematic transformation of European diplomacy from Bismarck's complex balance of competing interests to a rigid confrontation between opposing alliance systems. Germany found itself supported only by Austria-Hungary against a coalition that included not only France and Britain but also Russia, Italy, and the United States. This diplomatic defeat, while not immediately decisive, demonstrated the futility of German attempts to disrupt established arrangements through confrontational tactics while encouraging further coordination among Germany's potential enemies. The Bosnian crisis of 1908 to 1909 illustrated the dangerous interactions between alliance commitments and regional nationalism that would ultimately trigger the final catastrophe. Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, undertaken with German support, created a precedent for unilateral action that destabilized Balkan arrangements while encouraging Serbian nationalism and Russian involvement in South Slavic affairs. The German decision to support Austrian policy unconditionally, expressed in the famous blank check diplomacy, demonstrated loyalty to allies while abandoning the flexibility necessary for peaceful resolution of regional disputes. The Second Morocco Crisis of 1911, triggered by the German dispatch of the gunboat Panther to Agadir, again revealed the systematic nature of alliance coordination against German initiatives. The British response, including explicit threats of military intervention, demonstrated the extent to which the Entente had evolved from diplomatic cooperation into military alliance, while the eventual German retreat in exchange for territorial compensation in Central Africa represented another diplomatic defeat that strengthened hostile coalitions while failing to achieve German objectives. The arms race that accelerated throughout this period created military preparations that made peaceful resolution of future disputes increasingly difficult while consuming enormous resources that might have been devoted to productive development. The German decision to expand both army and navy simultaneously strained imperial finances while encouraging corresponding increases in French, Russian, and British military preparations. The technological innovations that enhanced military capabilities, improved artillery, more powerful battleships, better railway networks for rapid mobilization, created weapons systems that encouraged offensive strategies and discouraged defensive patience. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 provided a dress rehearsal for the larger conflict that would soon engulf all of Europe, demonstrating how regional disputes could escalate into broader confrontations through alliance commitments and great power rivalries. The German support for Austrian opposition to Serbian expansion reflected legitimate concerns about Russian influence in the Balkans while creating precedents for automatic support of Allied interests regardless of their broader implications. The Conference of London that resolved these conflicts temporarily preserved peace while strengthening the alliance commitments that would make future conflicts more dangerous. The military planning that developed during this period reflected the systematic preparation for general war that alliance commitments and strategic rivalries had made virtually inevitable. The Schlieffen Plan, refined through countless staff exercises and logistical studies, represented the German General Staff's solution to the two-front problem through rapid mobilization and the swift elimination of France before Russian forces could effectively intervene. This strategy, while militarily logical, guaranteed that any German mobilization would precipitate general war by requiring immediate attacks on neutral Belgium and rapid offensive operations against France. The French Plan 17, developed in response to German strategic planning, emphasized offensive operations designed to recover Alsace-Lorraine while supporting Russian operations against German eastern territories. The coordination between French and Russian military planning, formalized through regular staff conferences and detailed operational agreements, created the strategic cooperation that German strategy sought to prevent while ensuring that any conflict involving either ally would automatically involve both powers and their respective alliance partners. The British military preparations during this period reflected the gradual transformation of splendid isolation into continental commitment through recognition that German domination of Europe would threaten British security regardless of specific British territorial interests. The creation of the British Expeditionary Force, designed for rapid deployment to continental battlefields, represented a fundamental departure from traditional British strategy while providing France with assurance of military support that encouraged resistance to German pressure and reduced incentives for compromise settlements. The diplomatic correspondence that filled European Foreign Ministry archives during these years documented the systematic breakdown of communication and trust between the major powers while revealing the extent to which alliance commitments had replaced flexible diplomacy. The increasing tendency to interpret diplomatic initiatives as evidence of hostile intent, the growing suspicion of secret negotiations and hidden agreements, and the systematic coordination of responses within alliance systems created an atmosphere of permanent crisis that made peaceful resolution of disputes increasingly difficult. The press campaigns and public opinion manipulation that characterized this period reflected the democratization of foreign policy while creating popular pressures that limited governmental flexibility and encouraged aggressive responses to international challenges. The German naval propaganda, emphasizing the necessity of fleet expansion for national security and colonial development, created public expectations that made diplomatic compromise more difficult, while the French revanche sentiment and British concern about German naval threats generated popular support for military preparations and alliance commitments. The economic competition that intensified throughout this period created additional sources of tension, while demonstrating the interdependence that made general war economically catastrophic for all participants. German industrial expansion challenged British commercial supremacy while creating trade relationships that benefited all parties. Yet the nationalist interpretation of economic competition as a zero-sum struggle for markets and resources contributed to the political tensions that would ultimately destroy the prosperity that economic cooperation had created. The colonial disputes that punctuated this period, from the Fashoda crisis to the Morocco crises to conflicts over Portuguese territories, demonstrated how imperial competition could escalate into confrontations between European powers while revealing the extent to which overseas interests had become symbols of national prestige that could not be compromised without domestic political consequences. The systematic partition of Africa and the competitive establishment of spheres of influence in Asia created new sources of friction while providing precedents for the use of force in resolving international disputes. The technological developments that occurred during this period enhanced military capabilities while creating weapons systems that encouraged offensive strategies and discouraged patience in crisis situations. The improvement of artillery accuracy and range, the development of more effective small arms, and the construction of railway networks designed for rapid military mobilization created military advantages that would be lost through delay while reducing the time available for diplomatic resolution of disputes. The intelligence networks that developed during this period provided governments with detailed information about enemy military preparations and diplomatic initiatives while creating additional sources of mistrust and suspicion. The systematic surveillance of military attaches, the interception of diplomatic communications, and the cultivation of informants within enemy governments provided accurate intelligence while encouraging conspiracy theories and paranoid interpretations of routine diplomatic activities. The crisis management procedures that evolved during the repeated confrontations of this period created precedents and expectations that would prove disastrous when applied to the final crisis of July 1914. The pattern of ultimatums and threats, the reliance on alliance solidarity rather than compromise, and the tendency to treat regional disputes as tests of great power prestige created diplomatic habits that made peaceful resolution of the Austro-Serbian conflict virtually impossible. The mobilization plans that each major power developed in response to alliance commitments and strategic threats created military preparations that transformed political decisions into automatic sequences of military action. Once any major power began mobilization, alliance commitments and strategic necessities would require corresponding responses that would escalate regional conflicts into general war regardless of the original issues in dispute or the intentions of political leaders. The social and cultural tensions within each major power created domestic pressures that made aggressive foreign policies politically attractive while reducing incentives for compromise and accommodation. The growth of socialist movements, the emergence of militant nationalism, and the competition between democratic and authoritarian political systems created internal conflicts that encouraged external adventures while making diplomatic flexibility appear as weakness to domestic audiences. The psychological climate that developed during these years of crisis and confrontation created expectations of inevitable conflict while discouraging the patient negotiation and mutual accommodation that peaceful resolution of disputes required. The glorification of military virtues, the celebration of national greatness, and the systematic preparation for war created cultural attitudes that made the actual outbreak of hostilities appear as the fulfillment of historical destiny rather than the consequence of diplomatic failure. By the summer of 1914, the German Empire found itself at the center of an alliance system and strategic situation that made general war virtually inevitable given any serious international crisis. The combination of alliance commitments that required automatic support of Allied interests, military plans that transformed political decisions into rapid military action, and diplomatic habits that emphasized confrontation rather than compromise had created a European system that could not survive the shock of a major crisis. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, would provide the spark that would ignite this carefully prepared powder magazine, transforming a regional dispute into the greatest catastrophe in human history.
5. Перша світова війна 1914-1918 35 000 символів.
The thunderous roar of artillery that shattered the summer silence of 1914 announced the beginning of a catastrophe that would consume an entire generation and destroy the world that had created it. The careful calculations of the Schlieffen Plan, the methodical mobilization schedules, and the systematic diplomatic exchanges that had characterized the July crisis gave way to a mechanical slaughter that would grind on for 4 years, transforming the disciplined armies of the European powers into exhausted survivors stumbling through landscapes of unprecedented devastation. The German Empire, which had entered the war with confidence in its military superiority and strategic planning, would emerge as a defeated remnant of its former greatness, its armies unbroken but its society shattered by the demands of total warfare. The mobilization that began on August 1, 1914, demonstrated the frightening efficiency of military planning that had transformed political decisions into automatic sequences of destruction. The German railway system, perfected through decades of strategic planning, transported over 3 million men to their designated positions within a fortnight, while the mobilization of reserves, the requisition of civilian resources, and the transformation of industrial production for military purposes proceeded with clockwork precision. The enthusiasm that greeted the declaration of war, expressed in the jubilant crowds that filled Berlin streets and the patriotic demonstrations that swept across German cities, reflected genuine belief that the conflict would be brief and victorious, decided by the superior training and organization that German military science had achieved. The invasion of Belgium, required by the Schlieffen Plan's strategic logic, immediately transformed a regional conflict into a moral crusade that would mobilize world opinion against German methods and objectives. The systematic destruction of Louvain, the execution of civilian hostages, and the methodical implementation of Schrecklichkeit, the doctrine of frightfulness designed to terrorize populations into submission, created propaganda weapons that enemy powers would exploit throughout the war while demonstrating the extent to which modern warfare had abandoned traditional restraints on violence against non-combatants. The German military leadership, trained to view war as the application of scientific method to the destruction of enemy forces, found itself struggling with the political and moral implications of total warfare while maintaining the operational efficiency that strategic success required. The Battle of the Frontiers, fought during the opening weeks of the campaign, revealed both the strengths and limitations of German military planning while demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of modern weapons against traditional tactical formations. The French offensives in Alsace-Lorraine, launched according to the doctrine of Elan Vital that emphasized aggressive spirit over defensive preparation, collapsed before the concentrated firepower of German machine guns and artillery, leaving tens of thousands of casualties scattered across battlefields that would remain contested throughout the war. The German advances through the Ardennes forest and across the Belgian plains proceeded according to schedule, crushing enemy resistance and capturing strategic positions, yet failing to achieve the rapid victory that the Schlieffen Plan required for ultimate success. The Battle of the Marne, fought from September 5 to 12, 1914, marked the failure of German strategic planning and the beginning of the stalemate that would characterize the Western Front for the remainder of the war. The decision to will inward toward Paris, abandoning Schlieffen's original conception of a massive enveloping movement, reflected tactical adaptations to battlefield conditions while sacrificing the strategic coherence that alone could justify the enormous risks of the campaign. General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, commanding German forces from his headquarters hundreds of miles from the front, lacked both the detailed knowledge of battlefield conditions and the iron determination of his illustrious uncle, making decisions that reflected compromise and uncertainty rather than strategic clarity. The race to the sea that followed the Marne demonstrated the futility of attempting to restore mobility to warfare that had been revolutionized by defensive firepower and logistical complexity. Each attempt to outflank enemy positions resulted in corresponding extensions of defensive lines until the opposing armies faced each other across an unbroken front stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss frontier. The improvised earthworks that initially provided shelter from enemy fire gradually evolved into sophisticated trench systems protected by barbed wire entanglements, machine gun nests, and artillery positions that could destroy attacking forces before they could reach enemy lines. The First Battle of Ypres, fought throughout October and November 1914, consumed the trained reserves that Germany could never replace while demonstrating the impossibility of achieving decisive results through frontal assault against prepared defenses. The volunteer regiments, composed largely of university students and recent graduates who had responded enthusiastically to the call for national service, advanced singing patriotic songs into machine gun fire that cut them down in rows, earning this engagement the bitter sobriquet of the Kindermord bei Ypern, the massacre of the innocents at Ypres. The loss of these volunteers, representing the intellectual and cultural elite of a generation, deprived Germany of leadership that would be desperately needed during the reconstruction that would follow military defeat. The development of trench warfare created a new form of human existence characterized by constant proximity to death, systematic destruction of natural landscapes, and the reduction of individual soldiers to components in vast machines designed for mutual annihilation. The trenches that scarred the Western Front from 1914 to 1918 represented more than military fortifications. They constituted a new form of urban organization where millions of men lived underground in conditions that combined modern technology with medieval squalor. The elaborate communication trenches, supply tunnels, and defensive positions that evolved during 4 years of static warfare created underground cities complete with command posts, medical stations, and recreational facilities, all within range of enemy artillery that could destroy surface installations without warning. The Battle of Verdun, launched by German forces on February 21, 1916, represented the systematic application of attrition tactics designed to bleed France white through methodical destruction of defending forces rather than territorial conquest. General Erich von Falkenhayn's strategy aimed to exploit French determination to defend symbolically important positions by creating killing grounds where superior German artillery could destroy enemy reinforcements faster than they could be replaced. The 10-month battle that resulted consumed over 700,000 casualties while achieving negligible territorial changes, demonstrating the futility of attrition strategies when both sides possessed similar military capabilities and equivalent determination to continue fighting. The Eastern Front, where German armies achieved spectacular tactical successes against Russian forces, demonstrated the continued effectiveness of traditional military virtues while revealing the limitations of victory without strategic coherence. The battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, fought during August and September 1914, resulted in the virtual destruction of two Russian armies through superior German leadership, tactical flexibility, and operational coordination. Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, elevated to national prominence through these victories, became symbols of German military excellence while representing the ascendancy of military leadership over civilian authority that would characterize the later war period. The Brusilov Offensive of 1916, representing the most successful Russian military operation of the war, demonstrated the resilience of enemy forces and the continuing vitality of the Eastern Front despite German tactical superiority. The Russian breakthrough along a 200-mile front in Galicia forced German reinforcement of Austrian positions while demonstrating that military initiative had not been permanently lost by the Central Powers' enemies. The transfer of German divisions from the Western Front to contain this threat contributed to the failure of the Verdun offensive, while illustrating the strategic problems created by Germany's commitment to support Austrian interests regardless of the implications for German strategic priorities. The submarine warfare campaign that escalated throughout 1915 and 1916 represented German efforts to exploit technological advantages while demonstrating the international complications created by new forms of warfare. The U-boat attacks that sank merchant vessels without warning challenged traditional concepts of maritime law, while providing Germany with weapons that could potentially break the British blockade of German ports. The sinking of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, killing over 1,100 passengers including 128 Americans, created diplomatic crises that demonstrated the global implications of modern warfare while providing enemy powers with propaganda advantages that would influence neutral opinion throughout the conflict. The unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, resumed in February 1917 despite recognition that it would likely bring the United States into the war, reflected the desperate logic of leaders who recognized that Germany could not win a prolonged conflict against the combined resources of the British Empire, France, and Russia. The calculation that U-boats could starve Britain into surrender before American forces could be trained, equipped, and transported to European battlefields represented the triumph of military logic over political wisdom, demonstrating how total warfare created pressures that forced rational actors into increasingly desperate expedients. The home front experienced transformations that were as profound and traumatic as the military operations that consumed German manpower and resources. The British naval blockade, implemented through systematic control of neutral trade and comprehensive surveillance of maritime commerce, gradually strangled German access to imported food, raw materials, and manufactured goods essential for both military operations and civilian survival. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, when food shortages forced German civilians to subsist on animal fodder and ersatz substitutes, demonstrated the vulnerability of modern industrial society to economic warfare while creating popular discontent that would ultimately undermine governmental authority. The total mobilization of German society for warfare required unprecedented governmental control over economic activity, labor relations, and individual behavior. The Hindenburg Program, implemented in 1916 under the leadership of the military duo who would become virtual dictators of German policy, attempted to coordinate all national resources for military purposes through centralized planning and systematic conscription of both men and materials. The Auxiliary Service Law of December 1916 effectively militarized German industrial production while creating new forms of labor organization that would influence post-war social and political development. The political tensions that developed during the war reflected the breakdown of the civil peace that had initially united all German parties in support of the war effort. The Social Democratic Party, torn between patriotic loyalty and socialist principles, experienced systematic fragmentation as left-wing members organized the Independent Social Democratic Party in opposition to continued support for what they increasingly viewed as an imperialist conflict. The emergence of the Spartacist League, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, represented the development of revolutionary opposition that would exploit military defeat and social chaos to attempt the overthrow of existing political arrangements. The war economy that developed during these years of conflict created new forms of industrial organization and labor relations that would influence German development long after military operations had ended. The systematic coordination of production between government agencies and private industry, the development of synthetic substitutes for unavailable raw materials, and the integration of scientific research with practical manufacturing needs demonstrated capabilities that would later influence both German recovery and the development of state-directed economic systems throughout the industrialized world. The cultural and intellectual impact of prolonged warfare created new forms of artistic expression and philosophical reflection that abandoned the optimistic rationalism that had characterized pre-war German thought. The poetry of soldiers like August Strahm and George Trakl, the paintings of Otto Dix and George Gross, and the philosophical writings of Oswald Spengler reflected the systematic destruction of traditional values and certainties that total warfare had produced. The emergence of Expressionism, Dadaism, and other avant-garde movements represented artistic responses to experiences that could not be comprehended through traditional cultural forms, while creating new vocabularies for describing the dehumanization that modern warfare had produced. The military leadership that emerged during the war represented the triumph of technical competence over traditional aristocratic leadership while demonstrating the limitations of purely military solutions to political problems. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, elevated to supreme command through their Eastern Front victories, gradually assumed control over civilian policy as well as military operations, creating a virtual military dictatorship that prioritized strategic efficiency over political wisdom. Their influence over Kaiser Wilhelm II, increasingly marginalized as a ceremonial figure, reflected the systematic subordination of traditional authority to technical expertise, while demonstrating the inability of German political institutions to manage the strains of total warfare. The revolution in military technology that occurred during 4 years of intensive combat created weapon systems and tactical innovations that would influence warfare throughout the 20th century. The development of poison gas, initially deployed by German forces at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, represented the systematic application of chemical knowledge to warfare while creating new forms of suffering that challenged traditional concepts of military honor and legal constraint. The introduction of tank warfare by British forces at Cambrai in November 1917 demonstrated the potential for restoring mobility to battlefield operations while revealing the continued capacity for technological innovation despite the apparent stalemate of trench warfare. The aerial warfare that developed during the conflict evolved from reconnaissance and artillery spotting to systematic bombing campaigns and fighter combat that presaged the strategic air warfare of future conflicts. German Zeppelin raids against London and other British cities, while militarily insignificant, demonstrated the vulnerability of civilian populations to air attack while creating precedents for the systematic targeting of non-combatants that would characterize later wars. The emergence of fighter aces like Manfred von Richthofen and the development of specialized combat aircraft represented the beginning of air power as an independent military capability, while providing romantic imagery that contrasted sharply with the mechanized slaughter of ground combat. The final German offensives of 1918, launched after the collapse of Russian resistance-freed troops for redeployment to the Western Front, represented the last attempt to achieve military victory through traditional operational excellence. The Spring Offensive, beginning on March 21, 1918, achieved tactical surprise and significant territorial gains while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of German tactical innovation and operational planning. The systematic use of storm trooper tactics, coordinated artillery bombardment, and rapid exploitation of breakthrough opportunities created advantages that German forces had not enjoyed since the opening campaigns of 1914. The failure of these offensives to achieve decisive strategic results demonstrated the fundamental impossibility of German victory against the combined resources of the Allied powers reinforced by American industrial capacity and military manpower. The gradual exhaustion of German reserves, the breakdown of supply systems that could not sustain rapid advances, and the systematic Allied adaptation to German tactical innovations created conditions that made continued offensive operations impossible while leaving German forces exposed to counterattack along extended and vulnerable front lines. The 100 Days Offensive launched by Allied forces beginning in August 1918 demonstrated the extent to which the balance of military capability had shifted against German forces through the systematic application of superior resources and improved tactical coordination. The Battle of Amiens, beginning on August 8, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army, according to Ludendorff, resulted in the collapse of German defensive positions and the systematic retreat of forces that had maintained their positions for 4 years. The combination of tank attacks, artillery bombardment, and infantry assault that characterized Allied operations during this period demonstrated tactical innovations that restored mobility to warfare while exploiting German weaknesses created by years of attrition and resource shortage. The collapse of German allies during the autumn of 1918 created strategic vulnerabilities that made continued resistance impossible regardless of the situation on the Western Front. The Bulgarian armistice of September 29, the Turkish surrender of October 30th, and the Austrian capitulation of November 3rd exposed German southern and southeastern frontiers, while freeing Allied forces for concentration against German positions. The systematic disintegration of the alliance system that had supported German strategy since 1914 reflected both military defeat and the political exhaustion of populations that could no longer sustain the sacrifices that total warfare required. The internal revolution that began with naval mutinies at Kiel in early November 1918 demonstrated the complete breakdown of military discipline and political authority that prolonged warfare had created. The spread of revolutionary councils throughout German cities, the systematic collapse of administrative authority, and the emergence of competing political organizations reflected the social chaos that military defeat had produced while creating opportunities for radical political transformation that traditional German leadership could not control or comprehend. The armistice negotiations that began in early November 1918 represented the systematic humiliation of German military and political leadership, while demonstrating the extent to which 4 years of warfare had shifted the balance of international power. The harsh terms demanded by Allied representatives, including the surrender of military equipment, the evacuation of occupied territories, and the acceptance of continuing blockade conditions, reflected both the magnitude of German defeat and the determination of victorious powers to prevent any possibility of renewed conflict. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II on November 9, 1918, marked the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty and the political system that had governed Germany since unification, while creating a power vacuum that competing political forces would struggle to fill. The Kaiser's flight to the Netherlands, abandoning both his throne and his country in the moment of greatest crisis, symbolized the complete failure of traditional German leadership while providing a bitter conclusion to the imperial ambitions that had led to catastrophic war. The armistice that took effect at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, ended 4 years of systematic destruction while leaving fundamental questions about German political and social organization unresolved. The German armies that marched home from the Western Front remained largely intact and undefeated in the field, carrying with them myths of betrayal and stab-in-the-back legends that would poison German political life for decades to come. The empire that had entered the war with confidence in its military superiority and cultural achievements emerged as a defeated nation facing occupation, reparations, and systematic exclusion from international affairs while struggling to create new political institutions capable of governing a traumatized and disillusioned population.
6 пазня 1918 15:0007.
The silence that descended upon the battlefields of Europe at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month carried within it the death rattle of an empire that had dominated continental affairs for nearly half a century. In that moment of ceasefire, when the thunder of artillery finally stopped and the whistle of bullets no longer pierced the air, the German Empire passed into history as surely as if its territories had been swept away by flood or consumed by fire. The armies that stood at attention in their trenches, the officers who lowered their field glasses, and the soldiers who emerged cautiously from their dugouts witnessed not merely the end of a war, but the conclusion of an entire epoch in human affairs. The revolution that swept across Germany during those final weeks of 1918 possessed the inexorable quality of avalanche, gathering momentum as traditional institutions collapsed and established authorities fled their responsibilities. The naval mutiny at Kiel that began on November 3rd demonstrated how completely military discipline had been undermined by years of sacrifice without victory, privation without purpose, and leadership without competence. The sailors who raised red flags on their warships and established revolutionary councils in their barracks were not professional revolutionaries or ideological extremists, but ordinary men who had simply reached the limits of endurance and could no longer sustain faith in causes that had consumed their comrades without achieving comprehensible objectives. The systematic spread of revolutionary councils across German cities occurred with a rapidity that shocked both conservative authorities and radical organizers, demonstrating how thoroughly the social fabric of Imperial Germany had been weakened by 4 years of total warfare. Munich fell to revolutionary forces on November 7th, Berlin on November 9th, and dozens of smaller cities throughout the following days, as local garrisons joined civilian populations in repudiating imperial authority and demanding immediate peace. The ease with which established governments collapsed revealed the extent to which they had depended on popular acquiescence rather than genuine support, while the emergence of competing revolutionary organizations demonstrated the absence of any coherent alternative to the discredited imperial system. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man whose restless ambitions and erratic policies had contributed so significantly to the catastrophe that now consumed his empire, found himself increasingly isolated as even his most loyal supporters recognized the impossibility of maintaining royal authority against the tide of popular revolution. His final weeks as German emperor were marked by a pathetic oscillation between grandiose plans for military resistance and despairing recognition that his abdication had become inevitable. The generals who had once competed for imperial favor now avoided the royal presence, while the civilian officials who had implemented imperial policies sought to distance themselves from responsibility for decisions that had led to national disaster. The abdication proclamation, announced on November 9 while Wilhelm was still debating whether to surrender his throne, reflected the complete breakdown of communication between the Kaiser and the political authorities who claimed to represent his government. Chancellor Max von Baden's unilateral announcement that the emperor had renounced both the imperial crown and the Prussian throne eliminated the legal foundation of the governmental system, while creating a power vacuum that competing political forces would struggle to fill. Wilhelm's subsequent flight to the Netherlands, accomplished under cover of darkness and without formal farewell to either his subjects or his armies, provided a fitting conclusion to a reign that had consistently chosen theatrical gesture over substantive leadership. The Weimar Republic that emerged from the chaos of imperial collapse represented both continuity and radical departure from the institutional arrangements that had governed Germany since unification. The provisional government established by social democratic leaders inherited not only the immediate responsibilities of concluding peace negotiations and managing revolutionary disorder, but also the long-term challenge of creating democratic institutions capable of governing a population that had known only authoritarian rule throughout their political experience. The decision to convene a constitutional assembly in the provincial city of Weimar, rather than revolutionary Berlin, reflected recognition that the new regime required symbols and associations that distinguished it from both imperial traditions and radical socialist alternatives. The armistice terms that German representatives accepted in the railway car at Compiègne demonstrated the magnitude of imperial defeat, while creating conditions that would poison German political life for decades to come. The requirement to surrender virtually all military equipment, evacuate all occupied territories, and maintain the British naval blockade until a final peace treaty could be negotiated left Germany defenseless and impoverished while its enemies deliberated the terms of permanent settlement. The continuation of civilian suffering through prolonged blockade, which contributed to hundreds of thousands of additional deaths during the winter of 1918 to 1919, created grievances that would be exploited by extremist political movements throughout the following decades. The German armies that marched home from the Western Front during November and December 1918 carried with them not only the military discipline that had sustained them through 4 years of combat, but also the myths and resentments that would shape German political development throughout the interwar period. The fact that these forces had not been decisively defeated in battle, but had rather been ordered to lay down their arms by civilian authorities, provided the foundation for the stab-in-the-back legend that would blame military defeat on domestic betrayal rather than strategic failure. The orderly withdrawal of these units, maintaining their organizational structure, and much of their equipment despite armistice requirements, demonstrated the continuing vitality of German military institutions while creating potential instruments for future political intervention. The economic collapse that accompanied military defeat reflected both the immediate consequences of wartime mobilization and the fundamental structural problems that 4 years of total warfare had created within German society. The industrial system that had been systematically reorganized for military production could not easily be converted to peacetime purposes, while the financial obligations created by wartime borrowing and the monetary expansion that had financed military operations created inflationary pressures that would destroy middle-class savings and undermine confidence in democratic institutions. The return of millions of demobilized soldiers to a civilian economy that could not provide employment created social tensions that radical political movements would exploit throughout the following decades. The territorial losses that would be imposed by the eventual peace settlement were already apparent during the final months of 1918, as Allied forces occupied German territory west of the Rhine and ethnic minorities within German borders organized their own independence movements. The Polish territories that had been incorporated into Prussia during the partitions of the 18th century declared their independence and began organizing military forces to resist German efforts at retention, while Alsace-Lorraine prepared for reunion with France after nearly half a century of German rule. These territorial adjustments, while reflecting ethnic realities and strategic necessities from the Allied perspective, eliminated some of the most economically productive regions of the German Empire while creating irredentist grievances that would complicate European politics for generations. The cultural and psychological impact of imperial collapse penetrated German society more deeply than political or economic changes, destroying confidence in institutions, values, and leaders that had shaped German identity since unification. The revelation that military leaders had systematically deceived both government and public about the war's progress, that diplomatic initiatives had been conducted without reference to national interests, and that enormous sacrifices had been demanded for objectives that proved unattainable created a crisis of authority that extended far beyond immediate political arrangements. The systematic discrediting of traditional elites, military officers, government officials, academic authorities, and cultural leaders who had supported imperial policies created opportunities for radical alternatives, while eliminating the moderate leadership that democratic development required. The international isolation that accompanied German defeat reflected both the magnitude of wartime destruction and the determination of victorious powers to prevent any restoration of German influence in European affairs. The exclusion of German representatives from peace negotiations, the systematic dismantling of German overseas commercial relationships, and the prohibition of German participation in international organizations demonstrated the extent to which 4 years of warfare had transformed Germany from a respected member of the European community into a pariah state whose very existence was considered a threat to international stability. The revolutionary movements that emerged during the winter of 1918 to 1919 reflected both the genuine popular desire for radical political change and the absence of institutional mechanisms for channeling discontent toward constructive purposes. The Spartacist uprising in Berlin during January 1919, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, represented the most serious attempt to establish a communist government in Germany while demonstrating the fundamental weakness of radical socialist organization outside the industrial working class. The violent suppression of this rebellion by Freikorps units composed of demobilized soldiers revealed both the continuing vitality of military organizations and the willingness of moderate socialist leaders to use force against their former comrades in order to preserve democratic possibilities. The peace negotiations that began in Paris during January 1919 occurred without German participation, reflecting Allied determination to impose rather than negotiate settlement terms while demonstrating the complete reversal of Germany's international position since the heady days of 1871, when German representatives had dictated terms to defeated France in the same Palace of Versailles where German fate would now be decided. The systematic exclusion of German viewpoints from discussions of territorial arrangements, reparations obligations, and military restrictions created a settlement that Germans would universally regard as unjust while eliminating any sense of German responsibility for the consequences of imperial policies. The mythology that developed around imperial collapse emphasized external betrayal and domestic conspiracy rather than strategic failure and resource exhaustion, creating narratives that would poison German political life throughout the democratic period that followed. The persistence of imperial symbols, the continued influence of traditional elites, and the romantic idealization of the pre-war period created cultural foundations for political movements that promised to restore German greatness through rejection of democratic weakness and liberal betrayal. The failure to conduct systematic examination of imperial policies and their consequences eliminated opportunities for learning from historical experience while preserving attitudes and expectations that made democratic governance extraordinarily difficult. The German Empire that passed into history during November 1918 left behind achievements and failures that would influence European development for decades to come. The industrial capabilities, educational institutions, and administrative systems that had been created during the imperial period provided foundations for both democratic reconstruction and totalitarian mobilization, while the cultural traditions, social relationships, and political expectations that imperial experience had generated created obstacles to democratic development that would prove nearly insurmountable. The empire's rise and fall demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of power based on military efficiency and industrial capacity, while revealing the dangers inherent in political systems that subordinated civilian wisdom to military logic and democratic accountability to bureaucratic expertise. In the end, the German Empire had stood for precisely 47 years, from the proclamation in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles to the armistice in the forest of Compiègne. It had witnessed the transformation of Germany from a collection of agricultural principalities into the industrial workshop of Europe, had created institutional frameworks that influenced governmental development throughout the world, and had demonstrated both the achievements possible through systematic organization and the catastrophes that could result from the unrestricted pursuit of power. The silence that fell over the battlefields in November 1918 marked not merely the end of a war, but the conclusion of an entire epoch in the development of modern civilization, an epoch whose lessons would be ignored at humanity's peril. The empire had stood straight and disciplined, a monument to human organization and technological achievement. But the world had shaken beneath its feet, and in the trembling of the earth, the greatest military power in Europe had fallen, leaving behind only memories of what had been and warnings of what might come again.